Hi everyone, and thanks for joining the Talking Animals Law and Philosophy series. My name is Eva Bernes-Kempers and I'm a Junior Research Associate at the Cambridge Center for Animal Rights Law. For those of you who are attending the Talking Animals series for the first time, a quick note on the format. We'll have around a 30 to 45 minutes presentation, and then we'll have another 40 minutes for Q&A and discussion. The event will end at 6:30 p.m. UK time. You are all warmly invited to participate in the discussion. And in case you would like to ask a question or make a comment, you can either signal this in the chat or you can use the raise hand function and I will give you the floor to ask the question yourself. Until this point, I will keep all attendees' microphones muted. We will be recording the presentation part of this event and we'll be later uploading the video to our website, but we won't record the discussion part. It is now my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Nico Müller. Nico Müller is a philosopher based at the University of Basel in Switzerland. His research in animal ethics focuses on issues at the intersection of philosophy, politics, and movement strategy, and has been published in journals such as the Journal of Applied Philosophy and the Journal of Agricultural and Environmental Ethics, among others. His book, Kantianism for Animals, a Radical Kantian Animal Ethic, was published in 2022. His current research project, which is a part of the Swiss National Research Program 79, Advancing 3R, and funded by the Swiss National Science Foundation, addresses conceptual and normative questions related to phase-out planning for animal experimentation. Nico, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Eva. Hi, everybody. Thanks for taking the time. As you just heard, my name is Nico Müller, philosopher at the University of Basel. And I've been spending a lot of my days and a worrying amount of my nights thinking about planning the end of animal experimentation. So I'm excited to tell you some of my thoughts on the issue, and you should see my screen now. So the context for my thinking about this issue is that I've joined this national research program. And this was initiated by the Swiss government, the program, I mean, not my joining, by the Swiss government with two express purposes in mind. The first is to find approaches and strategies to overall reduce Switzerland's reliance on animal experimentation. Switzerland has had stagnating animal experimentation numbers since the mid-90s, roughly, and government is interested in reducing that. So that's one purpose of the NRP 79. Another purpose is to find, hopefully, some angles for discussions about animal experimentation that can move us beyond the entrenched debate that we've had about this topic in Switzerland. So in my talk, I hope I can give you some thoughts that relate to both of these themes, reducing overall animal experimentation and thinking outside the box about the issue. More specifically, I'd like to address three questions tonight, namely the following. First, I'll start with what is phase-out planning for animal experimentation? What are we talking about? What's meant by this phrase? Secondly, what kinds of policies would it require to actually do it? And what ethical issues need to be considered along the way? And I think without further ado, I'll launch right into it. Let me give you some historical context so we can understand this demand for phase-out planning for animal experimentation. If we jump back to the 19th century, then there was an anti-vivisection movement that burgeoned around the time when animal experimentation itself surged for the first time. In itself, animal experimentation is an age-old practice, but it really grew to a new extent around that time as the biological sciences themselves grew in importance for societies. And with that ascent of animal experimentation itself also ascended a protest movement against it. And this anti-vivisection movement back in the day wouldn't have asked for phase-out strategies. That wouldn't have been a wording used at all. Rather, they would have asked for a ban on the practice, which makes sense if it's not a new practice, but still a practice that's just up and coming. Very rarely did they succeed with these maximum demands for bans. I mean, sometimes they would ask for a ban on all animal experiments, sometimes just for specific kinds. Here's an example of a protest from 1919, where protesters campaigned for a ban on experiments on dogs specifically. Very rarely did they achieve these bans. More usually, they achieved regulation, for instance, in the form of the Cruelty to Animals Act of 1876 in the UK, which made animal experimentation subject to a licensing scheme. So it didn't ban it, it just made it subject to a licensing scheme. You had to be a license holder in order to be allowed to conduct animal experiments. And you had to observe certain criteria, like using anesthesia, and your experiments had to serve a scientific purpose. It couldn't be for an entertainment purpose, for instance. Even if this helped to weed out some of the most egregious cruelties at the time, it was certainly not all that the anti-vivisection movement was going for. And so they kept applying political pressure. Now, over and above mere regulation for animal experimentation, in the 20th century, a new policy idea also entered the stage, namely the idea of an alternative and policy measures to promote their development and proliferation. This is now, today, usually associated with a book called The Principles of Humane Experimental Technique, published in 1959 and written by two young research assistants called Bill Russell and Rex Birch. In this book, they advocate the use of alternatives, which can mean either of three things. The main option is replacement, meaning you're using something else that's not an animal, or at least not a live animal, in the place where otherwise you would have conducted an animal experiment. Or it can also mean you reduce the sample size, that's the reduction principle, or you refine your way in which you handle the animals and treat them during the experiment, maybe also during transport and husbandry. But that's sort of the approach here: replace, reduce, refine. And the political pressure exerted by the anti-vivisection movement throughout the 20th century was increasingly funneled into the creation of institutions that developed new alternatives. And that helped, one can surmise, to push for the acceleration of, for instance, in vitro alternatives, cell culture-based alternatives, more recently also organoid-based approaches, for instance, or organ-on-chip-based approaches. For those of you not familiar, organ-on-chip is a technology where cells are put on little plastic chips and connected through little tiny chambers and channels so that they mimic certain functions, certain systems of the body. And for instance, you can have a liver on chip or a heart on a chip or a blood-brain barrier on a chip and so on. So that's a very exciting way to explore scientific questions nowadays. And the list would go on. You could use computer simulations, you could use volunteer studies in some applications. So there's a wide variety of alternatives on offer now for certain scientific questions. Now, the 3Rs approach is very dominant today. If you look at a map, you can see that all across the globe there are centers and platforms that permanently advocate for 3Rs, for the use of alternatives. And even in the areas of that map that show up empty here, such as the whole of the African continent, China, Southeast Asia, even there, some activities are going on, even if they don't take the shape of a permanent center. Now, what's important to know about the 3Rs approach at this juncture is that historically, it was not connected to the ambition to phase out all animal experimentation, just some. Of course, the replacement principle was important. It was the highest priority in the 3Rs approach, and still is. But the ambition really was to overcome some animal experiments, the few select exceptions where we can achieve replacement. Whereas on the whole, the assumption was, for the foreseeable future, animal experimentation will remain inevitable, a necessary part of ordinary science. And it was only in the last 15 years that some in the debate have started to push for a more ambitious vision, namely that through alternatives we could overcome all animal experiments. And a noteworthy event along the way was the adoption of Directive 2010/63/EU, that's the European Union's Animal Experimentation Directive. In Article 10, it says the following: this directive represents an important step towards achieving the final goal of full replacement of procedures on live animals for scientific and educational purposes as soon as it is scientifically possible to do so. So here we have a major political body endorsing this ambition that in time we may be able to overcome all animal experimentation. And it even adopts this as a goal. So essentially saying we want to work towards this. Now, what's being endorsed here is not the goal of total abolition no matter what, right, of animal experimentation. The wording used is full replacement, meaning something is to be put in the place of the animal experiments we overcome. And this is reiterated with the phrase, as soon as scientifically possible. We don't mean to hold science back. We just want to increasingly do science differently. As good as all of this sounds on paper, it also soon led to frustrations, especially among animal advocates, who felt that not enough was being done to actually move towards this goal. It's no use to have a goal on paper if you're then going to do nothing to achieve it in practice. And this led, in the first instance, to some European citizens' initiatives. Here's one of them called Save Cruelty-Free Cosmetics. And despite its title, it wasn't all about cosmetics. It also demanded a comprehensive phase-out plan for animal testing within the EU in all applications. An earlier European Citizens Initiative, or ECI as it's also called, was called Stop Vivisection, and also employed the vocabulary of strategies and plans. In fact, the European Parliament has uttered quite similar opinions in adopting the resolution called Plans and Actions to accelerate a transition to innovation without the use of animals in research, regulatory testing, and education. The point again was the same one. Article 10 of the directive gives us the goal. Now we need a plan for how to achieve it. Now, what's important to know here is that not every resolution in the European Parliament is itself a legislative act. There's also what's called a non-legislative resolution, and this is one of them. So this encourages the European Commission to act, but it doesn't force it to act. And well, it didn't really pick this up. In the UK, around the same time, 2021, there was a petition to the UK government called Plan to Phase Out Animal Experiments. So we can see how this language of plans and strategies is starting to seep into the British discourse as well. More recently, the Labour Party manifesto for 2024 stated that the party wants to work towards the phasing out of animal testing, and some in the discussion have seen this as a commitment to do phase-out planning. I myself have to say I see the words phasing out here. I'm not really seeing the words plan, strategy, phase out. And you can work towards something without being particularly strategic about it. So I would take this with a grain of salt, whether this is really a commitment to phase out planning. But at least there's a commitment to phasing out, or some kind of ambition there is. In Switzerland, we've seen similar petitions to the British one, and also within Swiss Parliament right now, there are some proposals that go in the direction of demanding phase-out planning. So this, where I come from, is a current political discussion. One last example of the current debate is the debate in Germany. That's a very interesting case. Back in 2021, the German governing coalition, as part of what's called its coalition contract, promised that a reduction strategy would be developed. So not a phase-out strategy, but a reduction strategy for animal experimentation within Germany. And for the longest time, you couldn't hear or see anything about this. So since 2021, we've heard very little about this. But in September 2024, there was this press release that rather encouragingly stated that participatory procedure was started to engage stakeholders and anyone who's interested in giving input on what this reduction strategy should look like. Now, of course, a reduction strategy is less ambitious than a phase-out strategy, and we don't know just how much less ambitious this is going to be. By how much do we want to reduce what kind of animal experimentation? We don't know at the moment, but it's certainly something to keep an eye on. Now, as you can see from my really quick little overview here, phase-out planning is an idea that comes from the political debate. It doesn't come from a scientific debate. And one danger that there is, particularly in political debates, is that we demand things, but we don't define them, which opens the door for half measures and solutions that we might not end up being happy with. So let's try and be very, very clear what we're talking about when we're talking about phase-out planning. And sometimes, because players don't really define what they mean, we have to read between the lines a little bit. And I tried to do that in a paper published earlier this year in the journal Altex, where I looked at various different proposals, political proposals, think tank reports from different countries, petitions, some reports by government agencies tasked with strategizing in the area of animal experimentation and alternatives, and also some NGO reports. And despite all strategic differences that there of course exist between these very, very different agents, I think they are operating with a common notion of phase-out plan that we can distill from between the lines. And it's a very simple and straightforward definition. Essentially, a phase-out plan would be a document that defines three things. And they all begin with the letter M. So if you know the three R's, now you're about to know the three M's. The three M's are the following. A phase-out plan would have to define measures, meaning the actions to be taken by the respective institution, by the respective competent authority. And this can really be anything that this respective institution or competent authority can do. What people often have in mind when they hear phase-out planning is that this will be the institution of a series of diminishing quotas for licenses for animal experiments. So this year we're going to approve licenses to use 600,000 animals in Switzerland. Next year it's going to be 500,000, then 400,000, and so on until we reach zero. Of course, that's one possible type of measure that you could put in your phase-out plan if you want, but it's by no means necessary, right? Measures can be anything. It can have to do with revising regulations. It can have to do with moving money around. It can have to do with hiring and firing. It can have to do with anything that a competent authority can do. Also building up networks, providing infrastructure, providing funding, right? So really the field here is very, very open. The second thing that a phase-out plan would need to define is milestones. You need some intermediate goals along the way to your ultimate goal. And of course, you have to define your ultimate goal precisely. So what kind of animal experimentation are you actually trying to phase out here? What's at issue in the discussion mostly isn't just anything that counts legally as an animal experiment, but rather the subset of animal experiments that harm animals according to some legally recognized notion of harm. That's what most people in the debate are concerned with here. But then you still need the intermediate goals. And there's a lot of leeway here to design different phase-out plans. Again, people mostly think of the negative goals of what do you want to reduce, and they think of the overall numbers of animals used, of procedures carried out, and licenses approved. But you can also think about intermediate build-up goals. What infrastructure do you want to have provided by 2030? What funding do you want to have approved? And what networks of researchers, for instance, do you want to have built up in a certain time frame? So again, it's very, very open. And third, a phase-out plan would need to define metrics. We need to be able to tell whether we're making progress or not along our milestones. Again, sometimes these will be rather straightforward, but they can also be very complicated to determine if our milestones are more complex phenomena themselves. Okay, one more last comment about the three R's, the three M's of measures, milestones, and metrics. They are meant to interact. And sometimes people hear phase-out plan and they think this is going to be a prognosis for how we're going to abolish animal experimentation over a couple of years, and then this needs to be enacted with an iron fist. I don't think that's what the proponents are really asking for. This is a dynamic process, an iterative and learning process. So if we notice, thanks to our metrics, that we are missing some of our milestones, then we have to adjust something about our measures, right? This should trigger a course correction so that we are back on track, moving towards our ultimate goal. That's the point of phase-out planning. So really, this is a more flexible idea, I think, than people often give it credit for. But of course, the devil's in the details. So what kinds of measures should we think of here when we think of phase-out plans? Realistically, what kinds of policies would it require? And for this, one important consideration is what animal experiments are currently used for. What domain of animal experimentation are we talking about? In its response to the ECI Safe Cruelty-Free Cosmetics, which asked for a phase-out plan, the European Commission made a very basic distinction. It said it makes a big difference whether we're talking about animal experimentation for regulatory purposes or for research purposes. And if we just look at the numbers very quickly, then we can see that these are really the two major groups of animal uses in the EU, but it would be similar in the UK or Switzerland. Let's ignore the light blue and pink parts of the graph and just start at 12 o'clock and going clockwise. You can see here that in 2022, that's where the data was collected. Of the 8.48 million uses of animals for scientific purposes in the EU, some 37% served basic research purposes. Then come translational and applied research purposes with about 35%. So already you can see that research purposes make up for a majority of animal uses overall. And only lastly come regulatory uses with about 13%. Regulatory uses include, for instance, regulatory toxicology. So if you're a chemicals company and you want to bring a new chemical on the market, then the regulator demands some data from you before you get market approval. So you have to provide the data necessary to document whether your new chemical causes eye irritations, skin irritations, whether it causes a fever, whether it causes birth defects, and whether it's toxic to the environment in various ways, and so on. And interestingly enough, the European Commission is quite open to the idea of planning the end of animal experimentation in these regulatory applications. It wrote in the response the following: the Commission will immediately launch the work to develop a roadmap that will outline milestones and specific actions to be implemented in the short to longer term to reduce animal testing, and that would be prerequisites for a transition towards an animal-free regulatory system under relevant pieces of chemical legislation. So they are effectively promising a reduction roadmap with a view towards a phase-out roadmap. And it seems that this is not just a commitment on paper. They seem to be rather serious about this. If we look at their activities recently, they have started a participatory process just this September going into October to again invite stakeholder and expert input, or just the input of anyone who wants to have a say on what this roadmap should look like. All right, so that's a significant development here. Meanwhile, the same response is very, very negative about the prospect of planning the end of animal experimentation for research applications, which is the majority. Why this big difference? Well, in many ways, it's easier to plan the phase out of animal experimentation for regulatory applications, because here the regulator has clearly defined what data is needed and what methodologies are appropriate to obtain that data and then supply it to the regulator. So in principle, you can have a list, a full comprehensive list of all of the animal experiments that the regulator is still asking for, where there's no alternative yet. And then you can go through the list top to bottom and just try to develop and validate the still missing replacements. Or in some cases, you can also redefine the data requirements so that existing alternatives become better applicable. In some cases, that's also possible. So you can address the challenge through scientific innovation and through regulatory innovation. This is all very challenging, of course, and all of it flies right over my head. I'm not the expert for these issues, but what I can say is that the task is well defined. We know what to do in principle, even if actually doing it is very challenging. And the same is not necessarily true for research applications of animal experiments. Here, the regulator doesn't predefine what questions scientists need to ask, what data they have to obtain to answer those questions, and what methodologies they're allowed to use or that are appropriate to use to obtain that data, right? Science is very open-ended. It's part of the DNA of science that it identifies new research problems and new approaches to address those problems. So this is really a challenge. There's no full list of animal experiments that you would have to replace in order to once and for all overcome animal experimentation for research applications. And really, a few people talk about this, but it's been known for a long time, in fact. Back in 1961, the British scientist and regulator William Lane Petter, pictured here, wrote about animal research as a pipeline. He said that at any given point in time, there's a certain number of animals being used in research and a certain number of procedures is being carried out on them. And those are the numbers that you would see in an annual statistic. But even if the numbers, as in Switzerland since the 90s, are fairly similar year on year, that might mask some change of lineup that happens in the background. So it's not always the same animals, it's not always the same procedures being carried out. On the left-hand side of the graph, you can see animals leaving the pipeline through the innovation and uptake of replacements. They are no longer needed, so they get to leave. And all of the examples that I've already mentioned would be examples here: cell cultures, organs on chip, organoids, computer simulations, what have you. But Lane Petter emphasized, and that's really already in 1961, that there's also constant innovation within animal experimentation. Science comes up with new research problems, and scientists are going to address some of those research problems with newly innovated animal models and procedures to use on them. And in 1961, he couldn't have known how right he would be by the end of the century. Think, for instance, of the surge in genetically modified animal use. So in the 1980s particularly, and going through the 90s into the early 2000s, various new techniques were developed. It started with gene knock-in, knock-out techniques that are really interesting to use in animal models if that's the kind of work you do, because you can study what different genes do by knocking them in and out. So that helps you to make some basic advances. And you can also try to engineer animal models to more closely resemble certain conditions you see in humans. So this opens a range of innovative possibilities within animal experimentation. More recently, we've had the ascent of CRISPR, right? The gene scissors, if you want. This again has similar innovation potential. You can even more precisely engineer animal models now. And there's some parts of the literature that are extremely enthusiastic about this and I can't wait to explore these possibilities. And even if you don't want to go this sort of high-tech route to innovation within animal experimentation, you can go the low-tech route and use some non-standard species, as they are sometimes called. So just use some animals that are not so often used as models in science. Some philosophers of science are indeed worried that we are missing out on important scientific advances because we focus too much on mice and rats and zebrafish and not enough on Antarctic icefish or naked mole rats. Right? Any species could, on closer inspection, turn out to have interesting properties that either help us to make some basic advances or that make for an interesting model of conditions we see in humans. A real-life example is the use of non-human primate models for the study of rare human diseases. So the more we learn about the genetics of non-human primates and the gene variations that they also exhibit, the more we also notice that they have some gene variations that are interestingly similar to gene variations we see in humans with rare diseases. So animals turn out to be appropriate models, or at least surprisingly appropriate models, of conditions that we wouldn't even have thought of studying using these animals as models. So there's high-tech and low-tech variants of innovation in animal models, which means there's a constant influx. At least there's a possibility of constant influx of new animals into the pipeline. Traditionally, we are focusing our policy efforts on the exit side of the pipeline with all of these 3Rs platforms and centers that I showed you on the world map. We should think probably more about the entry side in addition, if we really want to bring down the numbers within the pipeline. And that's a challenge. That's a tricky task to achieve. How can we encourage researchers to innovate less in the area of new animal models and more in the area of new non-animal models? Doesn't even matter whether they replace anything that's happening within the pipeline. We just want them to focus on more animal-friendly innovations, whatever the research purposes are. And that, I think, is really where the key lies to successful phase-out planning for animal experimentation in research applications. One thing that can be helpful to think about for this purpose is what makes a good model. We can assume, in the spirit of charity, that scientists innovate new animal models when they see some scientific promise in them. So when they think that this new model that I can innovate is going to be the new best model for a scientific purpose that I already have in mind. And this raises the question, what makes a model a good model and what makes a new innovation in a good model a good innovation? And there's some literature that's really interesting to consider here. In a paper called How to Choose Your Research Organism, a lineup of important philosophers of science makes a very simple and straightforward argument. They say a model in the scientific context is really a tool, and the best tool is the one that helps you achieve your purpose. Therefore, the best model for you, the individual scientist, to use is the one that helps you make your best scientific contribution. Meaning, on the one hand, this model has to have some scientific and epistemic qualities. It has to help you study the thing you're interested in. It also has to be open for experimental intervention. It has to respond the right way. It has to be durable enough so that you can observe the behavior you're interested in tracking, and so on. But on the other hand, practical issues are also just as important. The best model from a purely scientific perspective is completely useless to you as a researcher if you can't afford it, if you can't access it, or if you're not trained to use it. So these practical concerns are really, really important as well. And overall, they come up with a list of 20 different criteria that can make a model better or worse in different respects. And without going through the whole list in detail now, just look at the clusters on the left-hand side. Some, like cluster B, tractability, or cluster E, promise, are heavier on the scientific and epistemic aspects. But access, resourcing, economies, those are really practical aspects. And when I look at this list of criteria, I'm really struck by how many of them are a matter of the built environment of science. At least the ones I'm highlighting in yellow right now. Ease of supply. How easy is it to supply this model that we're talking about? How standardized is it? How available are methods and techniques to use the model? Epistemic resources need to be provided. What are the training requirements? Informational resources, institutional support, financial consideration, community support, and what's the prospect of commercial and other applications? And how much am I supported in exploiting those potential applications? These are really a matter of the priorities set by my institution, by my funder, by my research community. Right? So it's a matter of the built environment of science, which means policy has a foot in the door here if it wants. We can try to use policy tools to create an environment for science that's as friendly as possible for the use of non-animal models and the innovation of new non-animal models rather than animal models. So we can try to build an environment where non-animal models are easy to supply, highly standardized, methods and techniques are available, and so on. Thereby, we make these models better models in scientific practice. We help researchers make better scientific contributions using them. And we make it more attractive to keep innovating in that area rather than in animal experimentation, at least if we can bring the environment to actually give an edge to non-animal models. So let me give you some examples here from things that are either being demanded in the debate or that have already been tried. Let's consider standardization. It's essential for a community working with a particular model that it has common vocabulary, common protocols for how to use the model, and common reporting standards, for example. And in the case of non-animal models that are still newer, oftentimes this doesn't exist to the degree that it should. That's not me saying it, that's what the focus group Organ on Chip standardization roadmap says, which was published by researchers, experts who actually develop and use organ on chip models. So they alert the public and everyone listening to the fact that they are still lacking common vocabulary, protocols, and reporting standards. They go into quite a bit of detail. This roadmap is quite large, quite detailed. What kinds of standards precisely would be needed so that this community can work together more efficiently and really build on each other's work? Because if we don't work with common standards, then the danger is great that we are talking past each other and that your results cannot be translated to my lab. So really the work is cut out for us here. All we need to do from a policy perspective is provide the resources to actually get the work done. So it's a matter of moving money around. Meanwhile, by the way, many animal models that are standard today have profited from decades worth of just these standardization efforts. So really what's needed now are some resource reallocations so that this work can be done for the newer and more animal-friendly models as well. Let me give you another example, financial considerations. The best model is worth nothing if you can't afford it. And it's essential that we account among these financial considerations also for the hidden costs that using a less established model also brings with it. If I'm the first person to use an organ on chip or a computer simulation in my lab, then I will have to figure out a lot of stuff for myself. I will have to do some labor that will not immediately translate into scientific productivity in terms of publications and citations. So I'm taking a career risk here. And the Dutch health research funder ZonMW, sorry, Eva, if that's not the proper pronunciation, has an interesting program to account for this. In this particular program, there's a track for biomedical research projects which receive 50,000 euros in top-up funding if they manage to be animal-free. So on top of your research budget, you get 50,000 euros if you make your project animal-free. And that, of course, creates a certain incentive, but it also simply compensates researchers for this unaccounted for labor that they have to do in addition if they want to go animal-free, because oftentimes these approaches are still less used. And let me give a third example, again from the Netherlands, that has to do with community support. It's essential in scientific work that you have colleagues that you can rely on, that you can discuss the smaller and bigger issues that experimental work brings with it. And oftentimes, if you use a less established model, you will have fewer of those colleagues available, at least on a local basis. In the Netherlands, there's an interesting innovation, which is called the helpathon model. Helpathons are workshops, essentially, where researchers can come with a research question or an idea for a research project that relies on animal experimentation. And then they exchange beyond disciplinary boundaries with other researchers, other experts, with other methodological experiences. And the purpose of the event is to find a version of the initial idea that is still as scientifically interesting, but does without animal experimentation. So instead of just finding the most animal-friendly method for the previously conceived research question, we try to revise the research question itself. And on the one hand, of course, this serves to make the individual project animal-free, which is a nice thing. But maybe more importantly, it brings people together in new constellations. It helps to foster new collaboration networks and provides at least a bedrock of community support. Of course, there's more you can do with policy measures to increase community support. I noticed this just within this NRP. If you pay people to work together, they usually will. And they will talk to each other and engage with each other's work and be able to support each other better. So just bringing people together by means of funding instruments is also, of course, an option. Again, it's a matter of moving money around. A promising phase-out plan will be one that tackles as many of these criteria as possible in order to first level the playing field for non-animal compared to animal models, and if possible, even to give them an edge. And the expectation is reasonable, I believe, that by starting with the yellow criteria, which are more responsive to policy interventions, we can hope to foster innovations that do better along the rest of the criteria as well. So I think this is the broad policy program that we should opt for here. Create the friendliest environment you can for non-animal models and steer innovation in that direction. Let the non-animal innovations set the research agenda. That's the goal here. Now, we don't just want to do this in any way, we want to do this in an ethical way. So what can be done to that end? What ethical issues need to be considered? And it's important at this juncture to look at what critics of phase-out planning have said. And staying in the Netherlands, I have an example here of SID. SID is a Dutch foundation that advocates on behalf of animal research, and ahead of the European Commission deliberations about the ECI Safe Cruelty-Free Cosmetics, they released this press release right here titled "An abrupt ban on animal research stops access to latest life-saving medication." Now, I think it's completely uncharitable to equate phase-out planning with an abrupt ban. I think phase-out planning reasonably connotes the idea of intermediate goals, of checking whether it works what we're doing or whether there are any unintended consequences, course adjustments, strategic flexibility, and so on. So I think the idea of an abrupt ban, that really belongs to the 19th century. I think that can't really be what's meant here. I think that's just talking past the point. But if we ignore this particular phrase, we can see that a legitimate ethical concern is also raised, namely if we dismantle the current ways of doing science, then there's a risk that we will incur avoidable harms. So people are going to suffer and die in ways that we could have prevented if we had used the full range of scientific tools available to us, including animal experiments. And the European Commission itself, after its deliberations, also raised similar concerns, writing considerable advances have been made in developing alternatives, but animal models remain unavoidable at the moment to understand some more complex biological or physiological processes involved in health, disease, and biodiversity. And I think, again, this hints at societal goods like health, disease, biodiversity. We want to be able to address these, and it would be a pity if we took away our own tools to address them. I think in itself, that's a fair ethical point to make, but I think it's a little one-sided. It's focusing very, very strongly on the breakdown part of a transition story and ignores the build-up part. Really, both are needed. And here's a neat model to think about this. Hebbink and colleagues have provided what's called the X-curve model of societal transitions, and they describe transitions as a twofold process. On the one hand, there's the breakdown story, which I'm showing with this red curve here. Incumbent ways of solving problems, when they face competition from new approaches, will try to optimize themselves, but then eventually this will give way to a phase of destabilization, increasing chaos, and then breakdown and phase out. And in itself, it's perfectly reasonable to be aware here that there's some ethical risks involved on that side of the story. Fewer basic advances when we're talking about a scientific way of solving problems, fewer societal benefits from science. And once we're at it, one might add, outsourcing of tests could also be a simple risk that also is to be considered. In Switzerland, when we talk about making anything better for animals, that's always the first concern that people raise. Won't the respective industry just move abroad? So in itself, I think that's a fair point to raise. But it's a little one-sided, because if this is truly a societal transition, then there should also be the converse development, beginning with experimentation with new approaches, the increasing acceleration into stronger trends, the emergence of winning solutions, and then the subsequent institutionalization and stabilization. And as aware as we should be of the ethical risks attached to the breakdown part of the story, we should also be reasonably enthusiastic about the ethical opportunities offered by these new solutions. More basic advances from different sources, more societal benefits, therefore, and also attracting new research. If we really do build up this friendly environment for non-animal models in Switzerland or in the UK, then this should also attract some research, while it may drive some away. And really, balancing is the name of the game here. A good phase-out plan will move along these two curves quickly enough to realize as many of the ethical opportunities as possible, while avoiding the ethical risks as much as possible. But really, the balancing is important here. And in fact, there's even more to balance if we regard the left-hand side of the X-curve model. Of course, one can always say that there's some ethical opportunities that attach to the breakdown story as well. In itself, it's a great thing if there's less harm to animals. And to an extent, it's also good if there's less faulty science in areas where animal experimentation has historically failed to deliver. And if you'd like to know more about that part of the story, then I refer you to Richard Miller's talk in the same series, because he knows much more about this than I do. And last but not least, we should also be aware that there's some ethical risks attached to the systems we're trying to build up. Innovation isn't always just a good thing. Sometimes it also raises new issues. And in this case, if we're talking about new technologies like organs on chip, organoids, computer simulations, if volunteers or tissue donors are involved, we need to think about what makes for a just treatment. How should we handle their sensitive data, their tissues? How can we ensure that these people are treated well, especially if we scale up these systems in various areas of science and regulatory testing? Another example here of an ethical risk is global injustice. Science already is extremely unequally distributed across the globe. It's not accessible to everyone. And there's a real risk that by relying even more on high-tech solutions, we exacerbate some of these injustices even more, right? And we should also think about who gets to profit how much from new advances that break through. Some people are going to get very wealthy if their tests that they supply become approved and made mandatory by the regulator, for instance. So some people are going to get very wealthy. Let's think early and seriously about how to regulate intellectual property, how to deal with patent regulation in this area, so that we have enough innovation in the area, but also accessibility of the new ideas. Again, balancing is the name of the game here. Ethical opportunities against ethical risks. And the best phase-out plan will be one that minds all of them in a fair and balanced way. Now, actually making the decisions here about which measures, milestones, and metrics should be used and how quickly we should move along these curves and what balancing is appropriate of the ethical opportunities and ethical risks, that's ultimately not up to an ethicist to say. It's also not up to a legal scholar to say, a scientist, or an animal advocate all by themselves. It's really up to societies to say. I almost said the sovereign, but I think in the UK that might be the king. But I think societies at large have to debate this, right? We need more democratic engagement on the how questions of transformation when it comes to animal experimentation. What programs do we want to foster? What infrastructure do we want to provide? Where do we want to see the money go in science? And I think really that's what the public should be discussing. In Switzerland, since the 80s, we've voted, because we've got a semi-direct democracy, we've voted 5 times on whether we want to totally ban animal experiments. The public always said no. This isn't leading anywhere. The next initiative is already around the corner. But I really think what we should be discussing is what should the measures, milestones, and metrics be? What do we want to see from this landscape of science in the next 10, 20, 30 years? Okay, so I really encourage that there's more public engagement on this. And if you want to contribute to that or lead by example, then one way to do that is engaging with my publications on the topic. Here's some of them. These are mostly open access, and you can find them also on my ORCID page, which is referenced here with the QR code. I'm always eager to discuss these issues, so do reach out on my email or social media as well. And before I end here, I want to leave you with one last thought, because this is the Cambridge Centre for Animal Rights Law, not the Cambridge Centre for Animal Experimentation Law. I think some of these issues, some of these considerations that I've put on the table now might generalize beyond the area of animal experimentation. Right? I've been offered an opportunity now to think through the issues with this specific focus, but some of the issues might generalize. I've been emphasizing the role of government in providing the right environment for a transformation, for an animal-friendly transformation of society. I've been emphasizing that phase-out planning has to involve build-up planning. We need to know what we want to build up, not just what we want to tear down. And I've emphasized that a public discussion about the how aspects of transformation is essential. We can't just keep going back and forth on the pros and cons of a disputed practice that harms animals. And I think in animal rights issues, so often a fundamental transformation is needed. So I think these guiding ideas might be helpful to think through some other issues in this area as well. And with that, I thank you very much, and I look forward to our discussion.